everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my February wrap-up. So February started out really good and then like kind of went off the rails a little bit for me. Because in the beginning of the month I read two books right at the beginning of the month that I really enjoyed. But then I hurt my back mysteriously. I mentioned this in my last currently reading video, so you may have already heard me talk about this, but mysteriously hurt my back. Don't know how I did it. I think it's just, you know, getting older and poor sitting posture catching up with me because I have a desk job, like, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But that kind of slowed down my reading because if I'm not like feeling well, I tend to not read, even if I'm like resting, so I have time to kind of sit around and you'd think that I would be reading. If I'm not feeling great, I tend to like watch things, like watch TV or YouTube or something like that. So didn't read a lot in the second half of the month, except for one book, and it was like, okay. So February, I read 3 books in total, and it's just, you know, been a lot of ups and downs with my reading life and with, I guess, like health stuff. Like, I'm gonna be fine, but it's been a lot of ups and downs with it. So let's just get started. We'll talk about what I read in February. Hopefully this won't be a very long wrap up. So the first thing that I finished in February was Well of Shades by Juliet Marillier. This was a reread. I reread the first 2 books in January and really enjoyed them. I read like the first half of this in January and then finished the second half at the beginning of the month because I had kind of a weird, like, I read the first half and then put it down for a week and then just like read the second half all in one day. I guess I should explain what this is about. I feel like I haven't filmed in a couple weeks and I feel out of practice of like, how does this work? Also because like I'm standing now, and I just feel kind of off kilter standing because I always sit when I'm like filming and stuff. But anyways, this series, in the first book, we're following Breedy, so it's historical fantasy. It is following Breedy, who was a Pictish king, and it's kind of, you know, expanding on his life. And the first book starts with him around 6 years old and follows him through his early 20s. And he is growing up in seclusion, being raised by a druid, kind of preparing him to become a king. When he's about 6 years old, he finds a baby girl on their doorstep, and he believes that it is a gift from the Shining One, who is one of their goddesses, and that they are like destined to know each other. Whereas everyone else thinks that this little girl is bad luck because she's probably one of the Fae. But her name is Twala. They end up raising her, and like the two of them grow up together, and she ends up being more you know, integral to his destiny than anyone would have expected. But that's the first book, and the first book is primarily following those 2 characters, Breedy and Twala. The second and third books have different main characters, so like side characters from the first book kind of become main characters in the second and third books, but we do still follow Breedy and Twala in the later books as well. They just kind of become like side characters instead of the central characters. So in this one, we are following a character who is kind of like the bodyguard and friend of Breedy, who has to travel back home to kind of confront his past because he has kind of this dark past that he left behind many years ago, and he has to go home to confront it and maybe like make amends and things. And along the way, he also has to deliver some unfortunate news to the family of a friend of his. So that is the beginning of this book, that he is traveling home and delivering this news, and then he like meets other characters along the way who become very important to him and the story. I don't want to get too much into it because it is the third book, but Yeah, I really enjoyed this, but the reason that I kind of like put it down for like a week in the middle was because that plot of him like traveling home to kind of confront his past, I was assuming that was going to be the plot of the entire book, but it's not. It's the plot of the first half of the book. So all of that, like him traveling, him getting there, kind of finding out what's been going on, like all that all happens in the first half of the book, and in the second half of the book, he kind of like travels back, and then there's like a different plot that's like connected but just like a different like point of the plot in the second half. So like I enjoyed both halves of the book, but after reading the first half I kind of felt like, okay, the story is complete, and so I just like put the book down because the part that I was expecting it to be was just sort of over. But then I picked it back up, and as I said, I just like read the second half of the book in one day because it was great. But yeah, so I really enjoyed this, and I gave this one 4.5 stars, and I am planning to do a series review for the Breedy Chronicles, so that will be coming, where I will probably like talk a little bit more about the books and like my thoughts on them. But yes, overall, really enjoyed the series. Okay, the other book that I finished at the beginning of the month was Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. I finally got around to reading this. I've been meaning to read this book since it came out and just for some reason never got to it. But I'm kind of glad now that I waited, because the second book is about to come out, and I don't know how I would have felt like if I had to wait like 2 years for the second book, although I guess now I'm gonna have to wait, after I read the second book, I'm gonna have to wait for the third one, because apparently it's a trilogy. For some reason I thought this was a duology, but apparently not. But this is fantasy that is inspired by the civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas, and there is some really interesting magic with like different kinds of prophecies and religions, and there's like crow magic in it, and there are these like crows that people ride. It's just a very interesting world. There's like a siren, all kinds of stuff going on. I feel like this book, I find it very difficult to like explain what is going on in this book for some reason. But it wasn't difficult to understand as it was happening. I just like don't know how to kind of articulate it back out, you know? I think part of that is because of the way the world building is done in this. I think that I've heard some people say that they felt like there wasn't enough world building in it, but I don't think so. I don't agree with that. I think the world building was done really well, just like in a kind of different way. The world building is more so in one of those ways that you just sort of like absorb it as you're reading. There isn't a lot of like really clear or straightforward like people explaining to you this is how the world works. You just kind of figure it out as you go, which is just like a different way of delivering world building, which I really enjoyed. I think that it did it really well. I think that Rebecca Roanhorse does a really great job of making you like feel where you are, giving you a sense of place, and that you understand what's happening without having to like very explicitly tell you this is how the world works. I really enjoyed this world. I think it was really cool, and I really loved how Rebecca Roanhorse gave that real sense of place, and like I really felt like I could feel this world, and I felt like I understood it really well, and I thought it was really good. I really liked the characters in this. We're following four points of view, and all of them are kind of slowly converging, which is just, it's very interesting to see like all of their journeys kind of coming towards this like point of convergence. But I found that while I was reading this, I really liked each of the points of view, to the point where like every time the perspective would change, I would be like mad about it, because I'd be like, no, I want to keep reading about this one character. But then like once I started reading about the other character, I was like totally into them and sucked into it and being like, oh my gosh, I only care about this character. And then it would change and I'd be mad again. I'd be like, no. And then I would be like totally into the next point of view. Like every point of view was great, which I think is very rare when you have like a multi-perspective book, to have like every perspective be so great. I just really enjoyed all of this. I am planning to do a review for this, but I'm gonna have to like collect my thoughts more. This is a little bit more like off the top of my head kind of review. I'm gonna have to like really like think about what I want to say about this book. But I gave this 5 stars. I thought it was great. I'm so excited for the second book. And then the final book that I read which was like the entire second half of the month, was I listened to the audiobook for Temple of No God by H.M. Long, which is the second book in the Hall of Smoke series. So this is a kind of Norse-inspired fantasy world. So in the first book, we were following our main character, Hessa, who was a priestess. And in that book, there were like different people like invading, and they killed all of her like village and the temple that she was a part of. So she kind of gets like thrust into the world on her own. But then there's also this mystery of like gods disappearing, and are they even really gods? And there's all this stuff that she gets like wrapped up in. In this second book, it takes place I think like 10 years after the first one, and at this point she's kind of like, in those 10 years she's kind of dealt with the fallout from the first book, and has a sort of tentative like peace between the various people that live in like the area where she is. But now there is a new threat, because there is this other empire that is the Arpa Empire, where there are 3 different like factions who are vying for power, and they kind of all, or they want, some of them want her to, or want her people to like help them or support them or get them magic in some way in order to kind of like win and gain power. And so she does not trust these people, but also feels that getting involved, like she doesn't really want to get involved, but getting involved might allow her some degree of influence on this as a way of like protecting her people. So she does get involved in that. Honestly, I found the plot of this to be a little bit maybe convoluted there, and I found some of the characters to be very indistinguishable. Like there were a few main characters that I definitely knew who they were, and then there were a bunch of other people that all just seemed like the same character. There was a point where I was buddy reading this over on Discord, and so there was a point where I was like getting mad at this one character, and then like a couple chapters later realized that I was talking about the wrong person, and I was like, I have completely lost track of who most of these people are, and I don't know what's happening. So I think that, with this one, since this is the second book that I've read from this author, and I had some similar feelings in this one as to the first one, in that I feel like there are a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of things that are very intriguing to me, and I want to understand. It's a cool world, she has cool ideas, but I think that we end up with too many either questions or mysteries or things that are kind of like up in the air, and not enough information or not enough kind of like figuring things out right until the end, that I end up getting frustrated, and I end up feeling like the story doesn't really have like movement or momentum to it. Like stuff's happening, but it feels like the plot doesn't really progress. But also that might be because I was kind of lost. I didn't really know what was going on in this. I kind of just lost track of what was happening. Yeah, so I don't know. I gave this one 3 stars because I felt kind of in the middle of it. Like it was fine. And as I said, there were things that I liked about it, things that I didn't, but I don't think that I'm going to be continuing on with the series. Also, something else I was gonna say is that for some reason they keep marketing this series as like a series of companion books that you don't have to read in order, which at least for these two books I think is not correct. I think you definitely have to read the first book before the second book, because there are things about the second book that I think wouldn't make sense if you hadn't read the first book, and also would spoil things from the first book if you hadn't read it already. So I don't think that they can be read and independently as like companion standalones. So that doesn't make sense to me. But those are all the books that I read in February. It started out strong and then like kind of went downhill, but it wasn't the worst at the end. It just was kind of like meh. That was my first 3-star book of the year. Everything else has been 4 stars and up. But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.